The air over Anchorage was crisp and still, yet every breath seemed charged with anticipation. Alaska's largest city had transformed overnight, streets closed, security lines drawn, and the quiet hum of normal life replaced by the low, steady rhythm of military precision. At opposite ends of the sky, two aircraft carved their way toward the same destination. From the east, Air Force One approached, its polished body catching the morning light, carrying Donald Trump toward a meeting that could define his presidency. From the west, a Russian state jet glided over the Bering Strait, bringing Vladimir Putin to American soil for the first time in years. Neither man came as a stranger to high stakes, yet the air between their arrival times felt electric, almost cinematic, as though the moment they would stand face to face was not just part of a schedule, but the opening scene of a story the world would never forget. Cameras waited, soldiers stood at attention, and beyond the security perimeters, people watched in silence, knowing that history was already on the runway. The air of Anchorage vibrated with unspoken questions. Inside briefing rooms, analysts and aides stared at screens that flickered with live updates. Global markets had rallied on hopes of a ceasefire, then faltered as expectations shifted, leaving Ukraine's future hanging by a thread. World leaders spoke of constructive talks, while others remained cautious, warning that what looked like peace might only be a strategic pause. Trump himself played his cards close, calling this summit a listening exercise, a prelude to a more consequential gathering that might finally include Ukraine. Across Europe, governments watched anxiously, uneasy that key decisions were being shaped without Kyiv at the table. On the other side, Russian officials projected cooperation, speaking of energetic efforts for peace, and hinting that the agenda would extend far beyond Ukraine to nuclear arms, sanctions relief, and broader global interests. Amid all the statements and counterstatements, one reality remained. This was a diplomatic gamble, a coin toss at the highest level, where both sides were already shaping their narratives to declare victory no matter the outcome. The tension was real. Would this encounter be the spark that ended a war, or the moment when the world realized the real fight was only beginning? By 6:48 a.m., the first buses carrying Russian journalists rolled toward Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, their windows shaded, their passengers silent under the watch of armed escorts. At 6:45 a.m., high above the Pacific, Vladimir Putin's aircraft had already left Magadan, its course set straight for Alaska, while from the opposite horizon, Air Force One carried Donald Trump toward the same strip of tarmac. At 7:08 a.m., Kremlin aides quietly hinted the talks might last 6 to 7 hours. And at 7:21 a.m., both sides began shaping the narrative that the agenda was about more than just Ukraine. By 8:10 a.m., Anchorage was tightening its security grip: convoys, checkpoints, snipers on rooftops, and at 8:22 a.m., flight trackers lit up as the Russian state jet entered U.S. airspace. At 9:24 a.m., the press center was alive, coffee brewing, cameras being checked, reporters passing through layers of inspections. By 9:45 a.m., workers had finished setting the backdrop with the words, "In pursuit of peace." At 9:47 a.m., the second Russian government plane touched down. At 9:54 a.m., a deep red carpet rolled out across the runway. At 10:23 a.m., Air Force One landed, its metallic frame catching the morning light. By 10:27 a.m., the White House confirmed the 3-on-3 format: Trump with Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff, Putin with Sergei Lavrov and Yuri Ushakov. At 10:48 a.m., Black Urus sedans lined up with military precision. At 10:55 a.m., Putin's aircraft touched down. At 11:09 a.m., they emerged almost in unison, two figures framed against the Alaskan sky. At 11:11 a.m., their hands met. At 11:15 a.m., They began the slow walk down the carpet as fighter jets thundered overhead. At 11:16 a.m. came the shot replayed around the world. Putin sliding into Trump's Cadillac, the Beast, the door shutting with a muted finality. And at 11:17 a.m., before the motorcade moved, Trump told the press that any peace must be agreed upon by Moscow and Kyiv themselves, but today was about building the path. By 11:21 a.m., the two men were already deep in conversation inside the car, disappearing into the secured base where the real negotiations would begin. As the handshake dissolved into the measured walk toward the Beast, the air beyond the carpet was alive with its own silent theater. The press line, a dense wall of cameras, tripods, and restless eyes shifted like a single organism, each photographer fighting for a fraction of a better angle. Long lenses tracked every movement, catching the slight turn of Trump's head toward a saluting Marine, the near imperceptible adjustment of Putin's cuff as he matched Trump's pace. In the background, aides from both delegations stood in tight clusters, murmuring into earpieces, their eyes darting between the principals and the motorcade, waiting like a black-armored snake coiled on the edge of the runway. Military personnel maintained their rigid posture, but you could see it, a subtle tightening of the jaw, the fixed gaze straight ahead, the readiness to move if a single cue changed. As the two leaders neared the limousine, the low idle of its engine became audible, a steady mechanical heartbeat under the roar of the departing jets. Behind the main vehicle, a line of support SUVs bristled with antennas and darkened windows, engines already humming, drivers watching the runway through bulletproof glass. Inside the press pen, whispers passed quickly. They're going straight to the base. No off-script remarks. Look at the formation tight as ever. When Putin paused before entering the Beast, cameras snapped like a swarm of locusts. When Trump followed seconds later, a low murmur rippled through the crowd, as though everyone knew that once those doors closed, the world outside was locked out. The motorcade moved in a slow, deliberate roll, the lead SUV cutting through the cool morning air, lights flashing in silent authority. And just like that, the runway was empty again, save for the fading smell of jet fuel and the echo of a moment the world would replay over and over, searching for meaning in every step, every glance, every frame. We can't know for certain what was said in those first minutes inside the Beast, but we can imagine it. The heavy door closing with a deep thud, the outside world instantly reduced to silence. Inside, the space feels less like a car and more like a moving command room. Thick, bulletproof glass softening the roar of jets, layers of armor swallowing every sound except the low, steady hum of the engine. Donald Trump takes his seat opposite Vladimir Putin, the polished black table between them catching slivers of the morning light that filter through the tinted windows. For a moment, they don't speak. The air is dense, measured. Trump leans back slightly, hands resting on the armrests, eyes locked on Putin as if weighing his first move. Putin's gaze is steady, his posture straight, one hand placed lightly on the edge of the table. In the front compartment, an aide speaks quietly into an earpiece, then passes a slim folder through the sliding window, perhaps a briefing, perhaps a map. Neither leader rushes to open it. Instead, the first words are exchanged slowly, with deliberate pauses, as if each sentence is a piece on a chessboard. Outside, anchorage passes in muted shades, the convoy cutting a silent path toward the base. Inside, the Beast becomes more than a vehicle. It's a sealed capsule where two men share a conversation no one else will ever truly hear. By 10:36 a.m., the press had been ushered into the meeting room for what would be their only view of the talks in the narrow 3-on-3 format. Donald Trump sat flanked by Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff. Opposite him, Vladimir Putin with Sergei Lavrov and Yuri Ushakov. The long, polished table between them gleamed under the lights, water glasses perfectly aligned, folders closed in front of each leader, Cameras whirred, lenses clicked the soundtrack of the press pool, but neither man spoke. There was no opening statement, no performative exchange for the media, only the quiet weight of eye contact and the subtle shuffling of aides at the edges of the frame. The moment was stripped of theatrics, as if both understood that the real conversation would begin only after the last camera left the room. At 10:45 a.m., the press was guided out, the doors closed, and the room shifted into a closed format where every word would remain off the record. The Kremlin would later release brief footage of this opening, a silent tableau of two leaders at the same table, the space between them charged with the unspoken understanding that the next hours could shape far more than headlines. Imagine a world where two nations hold the keys to the planet's fate. Two superpowers, long accustomed to playing the role of history's arbiters, Russia and the United States. Their relationship is an endless chess match, stretched over decades, where every piece represents economics, diplomacy, military might, and sometimes the lives of millions. Once, in the early 1992nd, it seemed that the Cold War was truly over. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and the leaders of both nations smiled at one another during meetings, promising a new era of cooperation. But behind the smiles lurked mistrust. Russia felt humiliated after the collapse of the USSR, while the United States saw itself as the victor, dictating the rules. From that moment, history took a path not toward unity, but toward a new confrontation. The Ukrainian crisis became the moment when all masks were removed. For Moscow, this was not just a conflict, but a matter of survival, strategic security, and the restoration of historical justice. In the Kremlin's view, NATO's expansion to Russia's borders was a red line the West had crossed. Russian leaders repeat, "We are defending our own." And in the eyes of millions of Russians, the war in Ukraine is not aggression, but a response to years of Western pressure, betrayal, and deception. In Washington, however, the story sounds completely different. There, it is described as an act of blatant aggression, a violation of international law, a threat to democracy in Europe. Politicians, from the White House to Congress, speak in one voice. If we allow Russia to win, another country will be attacked tomorrow. And these words are not just rhetoric. The U.S. is pouring billions of dollars into the war, sending Ukraine weapons, intelligence, and pledging to help for as long as it takes. But the longer this conflict drags on, the deeper the divide grows. Sanctions, economic warfare, technology bans, asset freezes, expulsions of diplomats, all of this has become the norm. Russia responds by strengthening ties with China, Iran, African nations, and Latin America, forming an alternative bloc that challenges the Western system. All of this unfolds against a backdrop of growing fear. In the U.S., voices are increasingly warning that confrontation with Russia could spiral into a nuclear conflict. Polls show that nearly a third of Americans fear their country could be drawn directly into war. And in Russia, despite official assurances of economic resilience, people feel that the world they once knew is disappearing. In this drama, there is also a deeply personal dimension. When Putin and Trump, or Putin and any other American leader meet behind closed doors, it's not just a protocol exchange. It's bargaining over the future of entire regions. Borders, oil and gas prices, military lines, cyber attacks, the fates of nations, and even the destinies of individual political figures are on the table. Every word, every leak, even a facial expression is analyzed and weaponized. The history of these relations is full of moments that could have changed the course of events. The Balkan crisis, the war in Georgia, the Syrian conflict, election interference, mutual accusations of espionage, and each time the world held its breath, waiting to see whether escalation would follow or whether the parties would step back from the brink. Today, it seems we are on the threshold of a new Cold War. Only now, the rules of the game are far more dangerous.
The battlefield is no longer just diplomatic halls and military bases, but also cyberspace, financial markets, and the media sphere, where news can be more dangerous than bullets. And in this game, there are no guarantees. One wrong move, one leader's misstep, one diplomat's error, and the world could plunge into chaos on a scale no one can predict. The US and Russia continue to exchange threats, but paradoxically, they still depend on each other. Energy resources, global security, arms control, all of this binds them into a knot that no one has yet been able to untangle. The question remains, will these two powers have the wisdom to step back from the edge? Or are we already heading toward a collision that could become the most dangerous chapter in the history of the 21st century? When Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump stepped out to face the press after their closed-door meeting in Helsinki in July 2018, the world seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't just another date on the diplomatic calendar. It was the kind of encounter both the Kremlin and the White House had been anticipating, as had every think tank from Brussels to Beijing. Two men whose decisions could shift the global balance of power stood side by side, smiling, exchanging handshakes. And all this came after years of acute crises, mutual accusations, cyber attacks, sanctions, and proxy confrontations across the globe. From the very first seconds of the press conference, it was clear this was going to be a moment for the history books. But it entered history in a way neither leader may have intended. Putin appeared confident, even relaxed, like a chess master who had just executed a perfectly calculated move. Trump, on the other hand, alternated between smiling and looking tense, and at one point openly questioned the findings of his own intelligence agencies regarding Russian interference in the 2016 election. The images went viral, sparking waves of reaction, triumph in Moscow, shock and accusations of betraying national interests in Washington. But what really captured the world's attention was not what was said on camera, it was what had happened behind closed doors. Officially, the meeting was supposed to last about an hour. Instead, it stretched to nearly 2. And throughout that time, only the two leaders and their interpreters were in the room. No transcripts, no recordings, no detailed briefings for the press. Even their closest advisors didn't know exactly what had been discussed. This vacuum of information gave rise to a storm of speculation, from secret deals over Ukraine to whispered theories about dividing spheres of influence in Europe and the Middle East. In Washington, lawmakers demanded to question the interpreters themselves to uncover the details of the conversation. The White House refused, citing the sanctity of private discussions between heads of state. That silence was louder than any statement. Veteran foreign policy analysts remarked that there were few precedents like this in U.S. history. For Putin, the meeting was an opportunity to show his own country that, despite sanctions, accusations, and attempts to isolate Russia, it remained one of the key players on the global stage. Russian state television replayed the handshake over and over, highlighting every moment in which Trump spoke about the need to improve relations. For the domestic audience, it was a diplomatic victory. Russia was no pariah, but an equal partner to the United States. For Trump, the optics were far more complicated. He entered the meeting at a time when the U.S. was deeply divided and the Mueller investigation into Russian interference was still underway. Any gesture toward Moscow was seen by critics as weakness or concession. Yet Trump seemed determined to project personal warmth toward Putin, betting that direct dialogue would yield more than diplomacy through intermediaries. Media outlets across the globe speculated, did they discuss Crimea? Were there promises to ease certain sanctions in exchange for cooperation in Syria or North Korea? Did they talk about oil and gas prices, which directly affect both economies? Or perhaps they spoke of a broader energy deal that could reshape the balance of power in Europe. The Kremlin remained silent, while the White House stuck to vague statements about fighting terrorism and shared interests in strategic stability. But leaks in the Western press hinted that the discussions may have touched on far more sensitive topics, including the future of NATO, and informal understandings on how each side would act in potential crises. Some analysts believe that after Helsinki, the Kremlin felt emboldened, sensing that the global environment was favorable for more decisive moves. The U.S. point friend was mired in political chaos. Europe was preoccupied with its own crises, and Trump, judging by his words, seemed more interested in finding common ground with Moscow than in escalating tensions. But the aftermath of the summit was explosive. Even Trump's political allies admitted his performance looked like deference to Putin. Congress began drafting new sanctions, and the Pentagon deepened military cooperation with Eastern European allies. In Moscow, the takeaway was clear. Meaningful dialogue with the USN could only happen directly, at the very top, and only while a leader willing to speak without establishment pressure occupied the Oval Office. Helsinki became a symbol of modern diplomacy. Behind the smiles lies a cold, calculated game, with each player keeping their most important cards hidden. And to this day, no one truly knows what was laid out on the table in that room. Now, years later, it's clear that the meeting did not bring a thaw. On the contrary, it became part of a chain of events that deepened mutual distrust. Above all, it proved that there are no simple talks between Russia and the United States. Every meeting could be either a step toward peace or the trigger for a new crisis. And the question that still hangs in the air is this: on that July day, did the leaders take a step forward or, without realizing it, push the world closer to another dangerous brink?